You're listening to the Served Up Show, a podcast that features inspiring beverage professionals and topic experts that share their passions through meaningful content. Your hostesses, Bridget Albert, is best known as the Market Fresh Mixologist, an industry mentor with over 25 years of experience. And I'm Julie Milroy, best known for my passion for leading change and helping others grow in their careers. Grab a cocktail and sit back. Let's learn how we can make a positive impact in our industry.
Hey, y'all, it's Bridget here. I'm really excited about this next guest, Nicola Nice. She is the author behind The Cocktail Parlor, How Women Brought the Cocktail Home, a captivating exploration of the often overlooked role that women played in shaping the cocktail culture as we know it today. Through her meticulous research and engaging storytelling, she sheds light on the influential women who left an indelible mark on mixology. Let's extend a warm welcome to our guest as we uncover the untold stories and celebrate the remarkable contributions of women in the world of cocktails. So go grab yourself your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and enjoy this really fun episode. Nicola, welcome to Served Up. I am really excited to have you on today's show.
I'm very excited to be here.
Wonderful. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your background?
Yes, I'd love to. So I'm Dr. Nicola Nice, and I am the author of The Cocktail Parlor, How Women Brought the Cocktail Home. And I'd love to tell you a little bit about how I came to write a book about the history of women in the cocktail, because it's been somewhat of a circuitous journey, but a fun one. So I'm actually a sociologist by background. So I have spent my career studying people, watching behavior, and translating all of this into insight that can be used by brands and companies to help them develop products and better sell and market the products that they have. And a lot of my career has been spent in the spirit space. So I'm one of these people who I would say I'm a true barfly in the sense that I'm not just there to enjoy cocktails. I'm also there to observe. And I love watching people and seeing what they order and how their behaviors change when different people come into the room and so on. I'm originally from the UK, and I first moved to the US, to New York City, in fact, in 2007. And if you'll remember, 2007 was really when the craft cocktail renaissance was really in full flow. And I just immediately fell in love. I fell in love with New York. I fell in love with hospitality, and I fell in love with a cocktail. And being a researcher, I wanted to know everything about it. I wanted to know, where did it come from? How did it start? How did certain cocktails get popular? And so I started to research more about it. And I did what any highly trained professional researcher does, is I started with a Google search. What are the most important books I need to read if I want to understand where the cocktail came from? And I found myself coming up with the same lists over and over again of mostly bartending guides written over the last century and a half, or stories about bartenders and the cocktails that they designed, or the famous books that they wrote. And I found it to be what I thought was a very one-sided story for two reasons. The first being obviously the focus on the bar as kind of the epicenter of where cocktails come from. Maybe we can talk about this later, but there's a big difference between what we might eat or drink when we're out having a hospitality experience and what we might make for ourselves when we're at home. So I wanted to understand, how does that translation happen? But the second is that up until maybe the last 30 years, most of those books were written by men, and they were written about men. And I felt that this was also very one-sided, given that if you go into people's homes, usually it is the woman in the house who is the hostess and kind of controls the menu and the entertaining schedule. So long story short, I felt like there was a story to be told here. And that's how I came about researching and then writing this book.
It's so wonderful. And just, as a female myself that identifies, as a she, her, and I've been in hospitality for 30 years. And I come from a long line of females, starting with my grandmother, her mother, her mother's mother, who all owned a bar outside the Chicagoland area. So it's really just fabulous that you took time to honor and celebrate women in our industry. And you go pretty far back in the book, as far back as like Martha Washington.
Yes.
So can you tell me what that experience was like? Tell our listeners, to do that research, to really to uncover these women in the past, just doing incredible things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will tell you, Bridget, that I went down many rabbit holes. It's interesting because, as I said, I wanted to kind of start with, well, where did the cocktail start? And obviously we know that no one knows for sure exactly how and when and where, but we know that the first professional cocktail guide was written in 1862, right? So we have that kind of date. And so I sort of just started with this hypothesis, as I said, that, our grandmothers, great grandmothers, where were they going for their information? So if I was running a household in the early 1900s or, even the early 1800s, and I was serving drinks, where might I have got those recipes from? So that's sort of how I went about it. And I just had this theory that if men wrote it down, maybe women did too. So I really just went hunting for books. That's kind of where, and it started, honestly, this all started as just a book collecting hobby of what are all the books I can find, over the last 200 years that have been written by women that include discussion of drinks and cocktails. And it started with a handful, and then it just grew and grew and grew into a library. So I have over 200 books now that, go back to the early 1800s. And as I was reading each of these books, I then wanted to know who was this woman? Who was the author? Where was she from? What was her life was like? What else did she write about? What was it like to be her, writing in that period of time? Like what might her house have looked like? What might have her drink service look like? And so that sent me off on many different rabbit holes trying to uncover more about the writers. So this took me to, obviously newspapers and to obituaries and I went to grave sites, like everywhere I could find information. So that's the sort of information gathering part of the research, right? Where you just I have 200 books. I have 200 or so authors. Let's line them all up in chronological order and then take a step back and say, what's the story? So that was the next next phase of the project, was to say, how can I distill in the end, I focused on 100. If I took 100 of these books, how could I distill this into a story that someone else would want to read? Because I think the most important thing for me is, some of these women you will have heard of, but you may not have heard of them or thought about them in the context of the cocktail before. So there's new information or new ways of kind of looking at the legacy of some women. But most of them you wouldn't have heard of, right? You wouldn't know who they were. And they did really amazing, cool things. So I just wanted to document their stories in a way that a wide audience of people could appreciate today and hopefully be inspired by. So it took a few years.
My gosh, I love that you went through such a thoughtful process, right? To select those women, to highlight them and to celebrate them. Can you share some of maybe the more surprising stories that you discovered in your research?
Absolutely. So there were a couple of themes or questions, let's say, that I had going into this. So, obviously as a researcher by trade, any piece of research starts with a hypothesis, it starts with questions, and then you look into the data to see if you have the insight that helps, either prove the hypothesis or answer the question and then lead you to more hypotheses and questions. So two of the big questions I had in the back of my mind was, how did the cocktail party start? Because I think that this is a phenomenon that we sort of take for granted. It is a uniquely American way of entertaining, which spread all over the world. And for a period of time in the mid-century, in the 20th century, it was the way we entertained. And we, of course, associate prohibition with a cocktail, but it didn't come from nowhere. It must have had seeds and roots somewhere for it to go from, to become a thing during prohibition. And then the second question I had was, why did it end? Like, why did we stop having cocktail parties, and what did we replace them with? So those were two big themes. And so in investigating those themes, of course, specific writings of specific women then became important. So to start with the cocktail party, there was a newspaper article in 1917, and I wasn't the first person to find this article. So some other researchers, Jared Brown and Anastasia Miller, I believe, had uncovered this article a while back. But it's basically the first reference in print to the phenomenon of the cocktail party. And it was referencing a specific party that was held by a woman called Clara Bell Walsh. And the party was in St. Louis, Missouri, on a Sunday after church in the afternoon. She decided to hold what she coined as a cocktail party. She hired a bartender, and she served like Bronx and Manhattans and various cocktails that we will consider to be classic cocktails. And men and women came to the party. They both drank the cocktails equally. And another thing that was interesting that was commented on was how the party took place as a standing event. And if you imagine that, like, Victorians and around the turn of and during the Gilded Age and the turn of the century, at that time, most entertaining was still very formal, very ritualized. It was all about a dinner or a lunch, and it was sit down, and there was like strict, rules about who sat next to who and what have you. And this was like way more avant-garde, right? For like men and women after church to just get together and have some drinks. So that was really interesting. But it wasn't the first time that women had organized events like this. This was already happening for sort of 10 or 15, I'd say, maybe even 20 years previously. And it all evolved from this, the very feminine ritual that we know as the tea party. And what happened was there was a class of young women around the turn of the century in cities like New York who kind of were getting tired of, like the excess and the stuffiness of that sort of late Victorian way of entertaining. It's very expensive. This was a period of time where, middle classes were emerging, right? They didn't have servants. They didn't have maids. They didn't want all of that very class-driven way of entertaining. So they sort of turned the tea party into this sort of much more casual, bohemian type of experience. And most importantly, two things changed. First of all, they started inviting men to the tea party. And secondly, they served booze, right? And the men came because of the booze. And so that was an interesting ritual that I think then sort of paved the way for this type of event to happen, in that sort of window between lunch and dinner, which by the time Prohibition came around, was already established as a way of entertaining, and then became the obvious place to pregame, right, during those years. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. What recipes really stand out to you from early cocktail parties that you discovered?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I think we also have a fairly sort of, I wouldn't say fixed, but I'd say there's like a well-established narrative of what classic cocktails are, right? And other people have done a lot of work to uncover where, drinks like the martini and the Manhattan and so on came from, and who first mixed them and a correct way to make one and so on. But interestingly, for these events that women were hosting around the same time, right? Around the same time as men were drinking their cocktails in their private clubs and then their hotel bars, and women were serving drinks at their tea dances and tea parties, was the prevalence of wine-based cocktails. So the wine cup, which was a punch-like drink that was usually served, in a bowl, beautifully decorated. There were also fruit punches, right, which didn't have alcohol in, but this was often like the centerpiece of the occasion. And every recipe book that I found from this period of time had like oodles of recipes for these wine cups. And they originally had sort of very straightforward names like the claret cup and the Moselle cup and the champagne cup, sort of named after the wine, right, that they were mixed with. But later on, as we were sort of getting into this pre-cocktail party era, they started giving them really creative names. So some of the examples I give in the book, like there were names like "What's Your Step" and "Whirligig," and and it's sort of representative of how they felt at the times that they were serving them, right? And I think that whenever I've read anything about cocktail history, often these wine-based recipes are missed. They're just left out entirely, right? Because it's not got a hard spirit base, and so people are not. It doesn't sort of fit the classic definition. They were way much lower alcohol content, right? So they're probably more like the equivalent by the time they were mixed and diluted to be sort of 5 to 7% ABV. And so maybe people don't consider them to be proper cocktails. But that's what people were drinking, right? So I think to me, those were really fascinating because I think there's definitely been a revival, in the last few years of things like sangria and frosé and what have you. Well, long before people were drinking frosé, they were drinking sherbets, right? And sherbets was frozen wine mixed with fruit, which is exactly what frosé is. So it was really fun to find those recipes.
So interesting. I'm just like amazed. I really am, that you're able to pinpoint, when the cocktail parties really started. Can you talk about how they evolved through the centuries?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So obviously during the 1920s, the cocktail party became, the fashionable way to entertain. And that was obviously by necessity, right? Because drinking was driven underground and it wasn't illegal to drink, right? So cocktail parties became the way that people would get their drink on before going to the theater or going to to a dry restaurant or what have you. But people had so much fun at them that then the party itself became the event in a way, right? So obviously in the 1920s, they became established. And during the 1920s, I would say that it wasn't everywhere. It was mostly in the big cities, and it was mostly, among the middle and the upper classes, the more urban population. But by the time Prohibition ended, it spread everywhere. There was somewhat of a dip in the sort of late 1930s and early 1940s, just because of the war and, because of the Depression and so on. And so there wasn't as much kind of exuberance happening as there was, say, in the 1920s. But by the time the 1950s rolled around, as there was an economic boom and there was a housing boom and people started moving from the cities into the suburbs, the cocktail party then is when it became established as the American way of hosting and entertaining that spread all over the world. So the 1950s was a really interesting time period, right? Because you have on the one hand this really, I think, the one of the first sort of examples of sort of consumerism, right? In the sense of, people wanting to show what they had and what they were worth, and, using drinks and spirits and cocktails and parties as a way to demonstrate that. But at the same time, there was also a regression in terms of the way women were viewed during the 1950s. a massive step back for women. And we haven't sort of talked about the importance of suffrage, happening around the same time as the Tea Party, but that was obviously an important element to why women were becoming more confident to hold, these boozy co-hosted, events. And in the 50s, the value of women was much more, focused on the home and focused on, it was regressive in the sense that, women were valued based on their role as mothers and wives and how well they entertained. And so it's interesting because during this time when we were very active in, in really orchestrating what the cocktail party was and how to host one. But at the same time, by the time we got into the 60s, they were starting to reject that, right? And that was part of a more widespread second wave feminism movement where women, with Betty Friedan's A Feminine Mystique, were starting to reject, their role as being, the entertainer and the wife. And so this is sort of effectively what killed the cocktail party, because, this role of being the server and the hostess was something that, women started to reject. And at the same time, more generally, culturally, there was a rejection of what people viewed as kind of very old, formal, stuffy ways of entertaining. And they started to embrace more casual, more co-ed, ways of hosting. And so we went from the cocktail party to the house party, the bring your own booze party, the open bar, just a much more casual way of integrating drinks into the way you host.
So interesting how being a trad wife, really has evolved and has changed as well, traditional wife, and how that has affected the cocktail at home movement. It's really super interesting. So can you take us up to really where we are today when it comes to cocktails at home?
Yeah.
And, even how the pandemic affected the way that we entertain.
Absolutely. So, I think that people often, when they talk about the history of the cocktail, they talk about specific periods that were important, right? So they talk about, we've mentioned the 1860s, Jerry Thomas's book, in 1862. We talked about Prohibition, right? So these were sort of seen as like the peak years of the cocktail. We had the 50s where, even though cocktails were prevalent and everywhere, there wasn't as much diversity in what people were drinking. They're basically drinking martinis, Manhattans, and old fashions and highballs, right? Those were the four cocktails people served at home. Unlike during the sort of Prohibition years where there was just way more proliferation of recipes. And then people often talk about the 60s, 70s, I think through to the 80s, 90s as being, quote unquote, the dark ages of the cocktail when people were drinking, very sweet drinks. It was just a drink and a mixer. It was less about the craft of making a drink. I do address this in the book because I think that it's actually a misrepresentation of what people were consuming. Not to say people were not drinking that, but it was a different style of entertaining. It was much more focused on in the home, on like the dinner party. And in the 80s, what you had was the emergence of the Martha Stewart era of entertaining, which was all about creating signature personalized experiences. And so, as I talk about in the book, that's really when the signature cocktail emerged as, if I'm going to have a wedding or a barbecue or a baby shower or Thanksgiving event, I need the cocktail that's going to represent that event for me, and it becomes part of my menu, as opposed to, picking a classic and serving the classic. So for me, I think that was actually an interesting era. And then, of course, you've got the 90s, and you've got, the beginnings of the craft cocktail revival. And I think everyone can kind of look back at the last 20 years as kind of saying this has been, a big golden age in the cocktail, as we have not only rediscovered the drinks of 100 and 150 years ago, but there's been so much innovation and invention of new recipes and new genres and so on. And I go in some detail in the book into the types of drinks that have kind of evolved on our home menus, over this time period. But I think post-pandemic, what we're seeing is, and a lot of people talk about this in our industry, is this emergence of the, again, I'm using air quotes here, but the sober curious movement, right? So the low and no ABV movement and the role of responsible drinking. And, what I kind of point out in the book is that for as long as women have been writing about drinks, we've also been writing about not drinking and the importance of hosting responsibly, the importance of recognizing that, you're going to have people in the room who don't drink for their own personal reasons. They don't have to have a reason. You're also going to have people who are going to want to control how much they drink and stay in control of what they're drinking. It's actually not a new topic at all, but I think it's one that post-pandemic seems to be kind of gaining momentum, at least in certain corners of the media.
Yeah, it's definitely not a new thing. I want to talk about just a couple things. First, some interesting, I'll call them like pop culture items that have come directly from a cocktail party, or I'm assuming that they have. One being like the cocktail dress, the cocktail handbag is another. And just some of those accessories that were used, either they were worn or some of the tools of the trade that came about as we were entertaining at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I have a lot of fun talking about this in the book as well. Is the book is a social history of the cocktail, right? So it's how the cocktail came into the home and how it impacted, our cultural rituals and norms and behaviors, which of course includes the way we lay out our houses, and it includes the way we decorate our houses. It includes the way we display alcohol, the way we give it. And of course, yes, the way we dress up for drinks as well. Right. And so the cocktail dress actually goes back to the 20s again. It didn't really become known as the cocktail dress until I would say the 50s. And it's often associated with Christian Dior as being the kind of first to really use that. Although, I don't go into detail in whether it really was him or not, but certainly the cocktail dress became an essential item in every woman's wardrobe from the 50s onwards. Although the ritual of dressing for drinks started with Prohibition. Cocktail, if you receive an invitation, right, to an event that says cocktail attire, right? You know what that means, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you will be drinking cocktails. You probably will, but that's not what cocktail attire means. Cocktail attire means that you're going to be wearing something that is not formal, but it's also not casual, right? It's a little bit dressed up. It's very personal to you. It's fun. It's flirty. That's what cocktail attire, and it sets the tone for, what the event will be like, right? As opposed to, formal or evening or, or any of the other genres. And it's just interesting that, that specific style, not just of dressing, but also of event, is named after the cocktail. So that's how symbolic the cocktail has become.
And it's so interesting. Even today, I throw cocktail parties here at my home. Mm-hmm. So, it's so relevant, and just, it's so fun to see how things have evolved, but then stayed the same at the same time, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's incredible. Yes. For our listeners that might not be aware, you mentioned like Jerry Thomas's name early on. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about, we hear about all the men that have paved the way for us in the hospitality industry, but you really don't hear about women at all, especially from his era. Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear from you on why that is, and, how you really foresee the future for women in the beverage space.
Yeah. So I think that's like, those are two very big questions. So let's start with the first one, which is, why don't we hear about women from the time period that Jerry Thomas was writing and published The Bartender's Guide? And that there's a big reason for that. So during the 1800s, so the sort of Victorian era, that was like the mid to late 1800s, there was a very strict separation of the sexes, and there was a very strict separation between the way men and women entertained and socialized. And there was also, this was overlaid into strict separation between public and private life. So what was happening in politics and business and what was happening in the world of the family. And if anyone watches shows like The Gilded Age, you'll see that this being played out, right? That, men were responsible for, the economic standing of the family, but women were responsible for the social standing of the family. And they had enormous levels of power within the domestic realm, right? And, had enormous budgets to go all out on dinners, lunches, and balls to prove their place and standing in society. However, had next to zero influence on what was happening outside their front doors, which is a big impetus for the suffrage movement, right? Like, no control over what's happening in politics, right? Even though, you have all of this control over, what's sort of going on in society in general. And I think allied with that is the fact that what gets written about and documented is usually what's happening in public, right? So it's usually public achievements that get documented in history and written about, and what's happening in the private space doesn't in the same way. So you have to sort of, you have to go and read books by, women like Edith Wharton, right, to get a sense of, what was actually, what were women actually doing during this time, and what was it like to be a woman during the Gilded Age? So I think that's a big issue with how history gets written, right? It gets written on the basis of what is set in the public record, and that's usually documenting what achievements are made, and then those achievements get attributed to men, right? You go to any industry, any area, and the same thing has happened, that women have been actively written out of the record or never written into the record in the first place. But that's not to say that they were not influencing, right? So women were writing books, right? They were writing books about cocktails. They were not writing bartending guides because they weren't allowed in bars. So how could they be writing bartending guides? But they were writing home guides, and they were influencing what was happening in the home. And even today, if 2/3 of our drink consumption happens at home, we should be talking to women about trends, right? So I think that's something that over the last, 150 years, finally, we've sort of woken up to. And I think as an industry, I would say only recently have started to recognize the enormous power and opportunity of putting women first. And I think that our industry has had a history of assuming that when it comes to alcohol, women are not as engaged, or they don't drink as much, or they're intimidated by it, they don't understand it. I've heard people say things like, women drink what men buy for them, right? Crap like that, right, has influenced our businesses for way too long. And just as an industry, we've left an awful lot of money on the table by not taking women seriously. And now finally, we are starting to see this change from the inside and from the outside. So from the inside, we're seeing more women get into, positions of influence within the industry. We're seeing way more women dive into entrepreneurship to create the brands that they want. And we're seeing more and more women, among consumers as well, just have more of an influence and a say on, on what we should be drinking. So I think we're in a good moment right now. And certainly, one of the things that was so gratifying as I got to the later chapters in the book was, I went from having just a handful of women to write about to to scores of women to write about. And so that was really nice to see the proliferation just on paper of women having an impact on drink culture.
Yeah, I think it goes for both home entertaining, like you said, and then, of course, in restaurants and bars and how empowered women are today. I look back, like the year that I was born, my mother could finally get a credit card without my father signing for it because women were not allowed to get credit cards on their own unless you were married and your husband signed for it. So for a woman to even have any sort of, if they have an entrepreneurial spirit, it would be very hard to start your own business without having someone else, really backing your dreams. It's so bizarre to me. So I think as a woman, it is critical and it's really important that we research our history about women throughout history, especially in the space that we're in beverage, and realize that we've been here all along, right? We've been making an impact all along, maybe not celebrated all along because we certainly have not been, but the stories are there. And so it's really important work that you're doing for people that like me. So I appreciate you as an author and as a woman. I support what you're doing 100%. I think it's beyond wonderful. So, and I think it's a book every woman should read.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a book every man should read too. I mean, I think that, I think anyone would read this book. And like you say, doesn't matter what age you are or, whether you're a man or a woman, you're going to recognize something in this, right? You're going to think, oh, I remember my mother used to host that way. My grandmother, like it's taking me back. And I think that, I like to say that the cocktail history is women's history. The cocktail wouldn't exist in the form it is today without the role that women have played, and importantly, the fight that women have fought as well. Because as we've gone through these successive waves of feminism, and with each wave, we're fighting something different, right? There's been a resultant impact on the way that we drink and the way that we socialize. And, it's a little sort of chicken and egg, which impacted what, but you can't separate the two things. So that makes it fun reading.
Yes. Can you tell our listeners where they can find the Cocktail Parlor for purchase and where they can find you on social media?
Yes, absolutely. So you can find the Cocktail Parlor on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble. You can go into any of your independent bookstores and find it on shelves or request it. You will also find it in anthropology stores across the country. And if you are interested in what you read in the book, there is lots more content for you to discover. So you can come to my blog site, which is called The Hostess Diaries. So it's thehostessdiaries.com, or you can find me or Hostess Diaries on Instagram. And you will there find a lot more content upcoming on the women who I feature in the book, their incredible backstories, reviews of the individual books, reviews of present day books, as well as an interesting take on restaurant reviews, which is focused around the idea of hospitality and hosting, as opposed to just a discussion of what you ate or drank.
I really love that. Well, on behalf of the Served Up team, I just want to wish you some great health, a lot of peace, and thank you for being a guest on our show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for taking an interest in the story.
100%. We have to support each other as women. So cheers to you.
Cheers to you, Bridget.
Thanks for listening. Served Up is brought to you by Southern Glazers Wine and Spirits. Produced by Zunu.online. Music by We Killed the Lion can be found on Spotify. Make sure to subscribe to be notified of future Served Up episodes. Cheers!